In 1996, a team of archaeologists working in the Lasithi Plateau region of eastern Crete made a quiet but consequential discovery. Among the remains of a Bronze Age burial site, they recovered skeletal material that would sit largely unexamined for nearly 2 decades. When that material was finally subjected to ancient DNA analysis in the early 2010s, the results did not simply add a new chapter to Minoan history. They rewrote its opening lines. The Minoans had fascinated scholars since the British archaeologist Arthur Evans first uncovered the ruins of Knossos in 1900. Evans himself had proposed that the people who built these remarkable palaces, who painted dolphins and bull leapers across their frescoed walls, who developed one of the earliest writing systems in the ancient world, had come from somewhere else. Egypt, he suggested, or North Africa. The sophistication of their art, their apparent ease with maritime trade, their early literacy, all pointed, in his estimation, toward a Mediterranean people with deep African or Egyptian roots. That interpretation shaped academic thinking for over a century. It influenced how museums described their collections. It influenced how textbooks framed the origins of European civilization. And for a long time, it was very difficult to challenge, because ancient DNA technology simply did not exist at the level needed to provide a clear answer. Now it does, and the answer, when it finally arrived, was unambiguous. The Minoans were not Egyptian, they were not North African. The genetic evidence shows a population that was fundamentally European in its ancestry, most closely related to Neolithic farmers from Anatolia who had arrived in Europe thousands of years before the palaces of Crete were ever constructed. The implications of this finding ripple far beyond a single island in the Aegean. They reach into the earliest layers of European prehistory, challenge long-held assumptions about how civilization was transmitted across the ancient world, and raise a series of questions that archaeologists and geneticists are still actively debating today. If you find yourself drawn to investigations like this one, to the kind of evidence that quietly dismantles certainties, the work here will continue. Consider following along as more of these hidden chapters in ancient history are examined. The story begins not with palaces, but with people. And to understand what the DNA evidence revealed, it helps to understand what questions it was actually designed to answer. The ancient civilization known to modern scholars as Minoan flourished on the island of Crete and across the Aegean region from approximately 3000 BC onward. By around 2000 BC, Crete had developed into a remarkably sophisticated society. The palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros were administrative and ceremonial centers of considerable scale. The palace at Knossos alone covered an area of approximately 22,000 square meters, with multiple stories, elaborate drainage systems, and rooms decorated with murals that reveal a confident, vivid artistic tradition. The Minoans were accomplished sailors and traders. Their pottery and other goods have been found in Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, and across the Aegean. Egyptian tomb paintings at sites including Thebes appear to show figures bearing gifts who have been interpreted by some scholars as Minoan traders or ambassadors. The civilization developed 2 writing systems, one known as Cretan hieroglyphic and a later syllabic script called Linear A, which remains undeciphered to this day. They worshipped a nature goddess, conducted elaborate ritual ceremonies, including what appears to have been bull leaping, and left behind art of a quality and confidence that seems almost jarringly sophisticated for its era. Yet for all of this richness, one fundamental question remained unresolved through most of the 20th century. Where did these people actually come from? How did this civilization take root on a Mediterranean island? And what was its relationship to the other ancient cultures surrounding it? The absence of a clear genetic answer left significant room for interpretation. Arthur Evans, working in the earliest years of the 20th century with the tools of classical archaeology and a Victorian lens trained on Egypt and the ancient Near East, concluded that the most likely source of Minoan civilization was Africa. He noted stylistic parallels between Minoan art and Egyptian art. He pointed to the presence of Minoan goods in Egyptian contexts. He emphasized the seafaring capabilities that would have connected Crete to the North African coastline. Evans was not alone in this interpretation. Over the decades, various scholars proposed origins ranging from Anatolia to the Levant to Egypt proper, and some even looked further east toward Mesopotamia. The diversity of suggestions reflected a genuine archaeological problem. Without biological evidence, origin questions in ancient history are extraordinarily difficult to resolve. Pottery styles can be traded and copied, architectural techniques can be borrowed and adapted, artistic motifs travel across cultures through commerce and contact without any movement of people at all. The history of archaeology is littered with origin theories built on cultural parallels that turned out, when examined biologically, to reflect diffusion of ideas rather than migration of populations. This is precisely what makes the ancient DNA evidence so significant. It does not rely on interpretation of artistic motifs or similarities in construction technique. It reads the biological record directly. And what it reads, in the case of the Minoans, is a story that fundamentally contradicts the African and Egyptian origin hypotheses. The study that changed everything was published in 2017 in the journal Nature. It was produced by a team of researchers including Wolfgang Haak and Johannes Krause at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, working alongside Greek and American colleagues, including George Stamatoyanopoulos at the University of Washington. The team analyzed ancient DNA extracted from the teeth of 17 individuals buried in a cave on the Lasithi Plateau in eastern Crete. These individuals dated to the Bronze Age, specifically to the period between approximately 2900 and 2300 BC. This places them squarely within the early Minoan period, before the great palaces reached their peak, but during the foundational period of the civilization's development. Extracting usable ancient DNA from material that is nearly 5,000 years old is not a simple procedure. The DNA from ancient bones degrades significantly over time, and contamination with modern DNA is a constant risk that requires extremely careful methodology. The Lasithi cave burials were well preserved enough to yield analyzable genetic material, though the team worked with what was available and acknowledged the limitations of a relatively small sample. What the analysis revealed was striking. When the genetic profiles of the Lasithi individuals were compared against a broad database of ancient and modern populations, the Minoans clustered most closely with Neolithic populations from Western Anatolia. They showed substantial additional ancestry consistent with populations associated with the Caucasus region and ancient Iran, and they showed very little to no evidence of ancestry from sub-Saharan Africa or from populations associated with ancient Egypt. This was not simply an absence of Egyptian connection. The genetic profile was actively pointing elsewhere. The Minoans appeared to be a population whose deepest roots lay in the great Neolithic migration that had brought farming communities from Anatolia into Europe thousands of years before the Bronze Age began. To understand why this matters, it is necessary to step back and examine what was happening in prehistoric Europe and Anatolia during the Neolithic period, which ran roughly from 9000 BC to 3000 BC, depending on the region. The transition from hunter-gatherer societies to farming communities was one of the most consequential shifts in human history. This transition appears to have originated in the ancient Near East, in the region archaeologists sometimes call the Fertile Crescent, encompassing parts of modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and surrounding areas. As farming spread westward and northward over thousands of years, it was carried in part by the actual movement of farming populations, not simply by the diffusion of agricultural ideas from one existing group to another. Western Anatolia, the region corresponding roughly to the European portion of modern Turkey and the Aegean coast, became one of the key staging points for this movement into Europe. Archaeological sites, including Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, dated to approximately 7500 BC, provide evidence of early settled agricultural communities that were ancestral in some sense to the populations that would eventually carry farming into Greece, the Aegean Islands, and ultimately much of Europe. The genetic evidence published since around 2010 has traced this Neolithic dispersal with increasing precision. Ancient DNA from European Neolithic burial sites shows that early European farmers shared genetic profiles consistent with an Anatolian origin. The Minoans fit squarely within this pattern. Their genetic makeup closely mirrors what we see in Neolithic Anatolian populations and in early European farmers more broadly. This places the origins of Minoan civilization not in Africa, not in Egypt, but in the prehistoric Neolithic world of Anatolia and the early farmers who spread from there into the Mediterranean basin. But the story does not stop at a simple identification of origins, because the same 2017 study also compared the ancient Minoan genome with another set of individuals who were central to one of the longest-running debates in Aegean archaeology. These were the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans are the Bronze Age civilization that ultimately came to dominate mainland Greece. They built the shaft graves at Mycenae, constructed the Lion Gate, developed Linear B, the writing system that scholars successfully deciphered in the 1950s, and left behind a legacy that fed into the Homeric tradition and shaped classical Greek civilization. For over a century, scholars have debated the relationship between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. The traditional view held that the Mycenaeans eventually absorbed, conquered, or succeeded the Minoans, and that Mycenaean culture was deeply shaped by its Minoan predecessor. The genetic comparison published in 2017 found that Minoans and Mycenaeans were closely related, sharing substantial Neolithic Anatolian ancestry. The Mycenaeans, however, also showed an additional genetic component associated with populations from the Eurasian steppe, specifically the kind of ancestry associated with migrations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe region north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea that occurred during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age. This steppe ancestry is significant because it has been linked in other genetic studies to the spread of Indo-European languages into Europe. The Minoans lack this steppe component, or show it in only minimal proportions. The Mycenaeans have it more clearly. This divergence has led researchers to propose that while both civilizations share deep Neolithic roots, the Mycenaeans also absorbed ancestry from later incoming populations who brought with them elements of what would become the Indo-European linguistic and cultural tradition. This genetic distinction may help explain one of the enduring puzzles of Aegean archaeology. Linear A, the Minoan writing system, remains undeciphered and is not believed to belong to an Indo-European language family. Linear B, the Mycenaean system, was shown by Michael Ventris in 1952 to be an early form of Greek, an Indo-European language. The genetic divergence between Minoans and Mycenaeans may therefore reflect a real linguistic and cultural divide, with the Minoans representing an older, pre-Indo-European stratum of Aegean civilization and the Mycenaeans representing a population that had absorbed Indo-European ancestry from the steppe migrations. None of this was known before the ancient DNA evidence was examined. For a century, archaeologists had been debating whether the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations were fundamentally the same people or fundamentally different people, and the cultural evidence, while suggestive, could not resolve the question definitively. The genetic evidence is not a complete answer because genetics does not translate directly into language, culture, or identity, but it provides a biological framework that was entirely absent before. And when that biological framework is placed alongside the archaeological record, the picture that emerges is considerably more complex and considerably more interesting than the older theories of Egyptian or African origin ever managed to produce. Consider what we now know about the world the Minoans inhabited. When the earliest recognizable Minoan communities were establishing themselves on Crete, sometime around 3000 BC, they were doing so in a Mediterranean world that was already deeply interconnected. The Eastern Mediterranean of the early Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated civilizations operating independently. Egypt had reached the First Dynasty period. Mesopotamia had developed sophisticated urban cultures in Sumer. The Levant was a complex zone of trade and contact, and the Aegean was not simply a passive receiver of cultural influence from these larger centers. The DNA evidence reinforces what the archaeological record has been suggesting for some time. Crete was not a colony or an outpost of Egypt. It was an independent center of cultural development rooted in European and Near Eastern Neolithic traditions, and it became one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the Bronze Age on its own terms. But here is where the evidence becomes more challenging to interpret. Because while the genetic data is clear about what the Minoans were not, it is more ambiguous about the full complexity of what they were. A 2017 study is necessarily limited by the number of individuals sampled, the preservation of the skeletal material, and the analytical methods available at the time. 17 individuals from a single cave site on the Lasithi Plateau cannot be assumed to represent the full genetic diversity of a civilization that spanned centuries and included multiple distinct population centers across Crete and the broader Aegean. Subsequent studies, including work published in the early 2020s, have expanded the ancient Aegean dataset considerably. What this expanded picture reveals is that the Bronze Age Aegean was genetically diverse, that migration and movement were ongoing features of the period, and that the neat genetic categories proposed in early studies represent only the beginning of what will eventually be a much more detailed picture. Some of the newer evidence suggests that later Minoan populations, those living in the 2nd millennium BC when the palaces were at their height, show slightly different genetic profiles from the earlier Lasithi individuals, including in some cases a higher proportion of the Caucasus-related ancestry that was already present in the founding population. This does not undermine the core finding that the Minoans were not of Egyptian or North African origin, but it does suggest that the genetic history of Crete during the Bronze Age involved ongoing movement and mixing of populations rather than a single founding event followed by isolation. This makes historical sense. Crete was a maritime trading civilization. Its position in the center of the eastern Mediterranean made it a natural crossroads. Ships arrived from Egypt, from the Levant, from the Cycladic Islands, from the Greek mainland, and from further afield. Merchants, craftspeople, diplomats, and perhaps entire communities came and went. The idea that the population of Bronze Age Crete remained genetically static across a civilization that lasted over a millennium would have been surprising regardless of what the DNA showed. What the DNA shows is that the ancestral foundation of this cosmopolitan, mobile, trading civilization was Neolithic Anatolian European, not African, not Egyptian. Whatever Egyptian influence appears in Minoan art and material culture, it arrived through trade and cultural contact, not through a founding population migration from the Nile Valley. This is an important distinction, and it connects to one of the broader methodological challenges in ancient history. The Mediterranean of the Bronze Age produced extraordinary evidence of long-distance contact. Egyptian objects have been found in Crete. Minoan-style frescoes have been found in the Levant, at the site of Tel Kabri, in modern Israel, and at Avaris in the Nile Delta itself. Cypriot copper moved in enormous quantities across the eastern Mediterranean. Canaanite storage jars have been found in Greece. The famous Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey in the 1980s, contained cargo from at least 7 different cultural traditions and demonstrated that Mediterranean trade networks of the late Bronze Age were astonishingly sophisticated. None of this contact, however extensive, produces genetic homogeneity. Goods travel more easily than people. Artistic styles are adopted and adapted without requiring mass population movements. A Minoan craftsman, painting an Egyptian-style motif on a fresco at Knossos, was expressing cultural influence, not biological ancestry. The failure to make this distinction clearly is what led earlier scholars astray. Arthur Evans looked at Minoan art and saw Egyptian parallels. He was not wrong that the parallels existed. He was wrong in concluding that those parallels required an Egyptian origin population. The DNA evidence exposes the logical gap in that reasoning clearly. But the reversal of the Egyptian hypothesis is only one part of what the genetic evidence changes about European history. The deeper implication lies in what the Minoan genetic profile tells us about the deep prehistory of Europe itself. The connection between the Minoans and Neolithic Anatolian farmers places one of the most sophisticated and culturally influential civilizations of the ancient world squarely within a broader story of European demographic and cultural development. This story begins much earlier than the Minoan palaces, back in the period between 7000 and 5000 BC, when farming communities moved out of Anatolia and into Europe. The early European farmers, as geneticists refer to this population, did not simply introduce new food production techniques. They brought with them an entire package of cultural practices, material traditions, and social structures that transformed European communities over thousands of years. They built the megalithic monuments of Western Europe, They developed the early ceramic traditions of the Neolithic. They established the social patterns that would eventually give rise to more complex stratified societies. For a long time, European prehistory was written in a way that underemphasized this deep Neolithic layer. The classical tradition focused attention on Greece and Rome as the foundations of Western civilization, with Greece presented largely as a unique flowering that emerged somewhat mysteriously in the first millennium BC. The discovery and interpretation of Minoan civilization complicated this picture somewhat, since it showed that sophisticated culture on European soil was much older than classical Greece. But because the Minoans were often framed as culturally dependent on Egypt or the Near East, their significance as a genuinely European cultural development was underplayed. The DNA evidence forces a reassessment. If the Minoans were fundamentally rooted in the Neolithic Anatolian tradition that also seeded the rest of Europe, then they represent not an outlier or an import from Africa, but a fully indigenous development within the broader family of European Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples. Their extraordinary achievements in architecture, art, administration and trade were not borrowed wholesale from more advanced foreign civilizations. They were the product of a European tradition that had been developing for thousands of years before the palaces of Knossos were ever constructed. This reframing has significant implications for how we understand the origins of European civilization more broadly. The conventional narrative tends to draw a line from Egypt and Mesopotamia to Greece, and then from Greece to Rome, and then from Rome to modern Western civilization. In this narrative, Europe is a receiver of civilizational knowledge from more advanced ancient cultures to the south and east. The Minoan DNA evidence does not simply challenge one detail of this narrative, it challenges its fundamental structure. What the evidence suggests instead is a model in which the people who built Bronze Age Crete were themselves the inheritors of a deep Neolithic tradition rooted in Anatolia and shaped by thousands of years of development in Europe and the Aegean. When these people eventually developed palace architecture, sophisticated administration, and long-distance trade networks, they were drawing on a cultural inheritance that was their own and that connected them to a broader family of European agricultural civilizations stretching back millennia. This does not mean that Egyptian and Near Eastern influence on Minoan civilization was insignificant. The evidence for cultural contact and exchange is too substantial to dismiss, but it means that the Minoans met that influence as peers, as a sophisticated independent civilization capable of selective adoption and creative adaptation, not as a culturally dependent recipient population that had received its civilizational template from Egypt. The art of Knossos makes much more sense when viewed through this lens. The famous Minoan frescoes are often compared to Egyptian painting, and the comparison is not unreasonable. Both traditions use similar conventions including profile figures, bright colors, and registers that organize narrative scenes. But anyone who has spent time with both traditions also notices how different they are. Minoan art is more naturalistic in some respects, more playful, more focused on the natural world, dolphins, octopuses, flowers, birds, and on human figures in motion. Egyptian art is more formal, more hieratic, more concerned with conveying status and divine hierarchy. The similarities reflect contact and shared cultural grammar across the Eastern Mediterranean. The differences reflect independent development rooted in different social and religious frameworks. Now consider the Linear A writing system. This script, which appears on tablets, seals, and other objects from Minoan Crete, has never been deciphered. Scholars generally agree that it is not related to Egyptian hieroglyphs or to any Semitic writing system. The signs appear to have been adapted from the earlier Cretan hieroglyphic script, which is also undeciphered. Various researchers have proposed connections to a range of languages, but none of these proposals has achieved scholarly consensus. The language, whatever it was, appears to be a genuine isolate, or at least a member of a linguistic family that has not yet been identified with certainty. This linguistic independence is consistent with the genetic picture. If the Minoans were not Egyptians and not Semitic-speaking Levantines, and the DNA points toward a Neolithic Anatolian foundation with possible Caucasus-related contributions, then the language they spoke may have belonged to a pre-Indo-European family of languages, that was once much more widespread across the Mediterranean and Near East, before being replaced by Indo-European and Semitic languages during the Bronze Age and after. Some researchers have proposed connections between Linear A and the Minoan language, which is attested in later inscriptions from Crete, and which may represent a continuation of the Bronze Age Minoan linguistic tradition into the first millennium BC. Others have suggested comparisons with languages from the Aegean Bronze Age more broadly, including Lemnian, which was spoken on the island of Lemnos and has been tentatively linked to Etruscan in Italy. None of these connections has been definitively established, but they point toward a world in which pre-Indo-European languages occupied a much larger geographic space in prehistoric Europe than the classical record would suggest. The DNA evidence supports this picture. The Minoans represent a population whose Neolithic Anatolian ancestry connects them to a wave of migration that preceded the Indo-European expansions. If their language was a remnant of this earlier layer of Mediterranean linguistic diversity, then their genetic and linguistic profiles are consistent with each other in a way that actually helps explain both. The question of what happened to the Minoans, and when, and why, is one of the most debated problems in Bronze Age archaeology. The Minoan civilization reached its apparent peak sometime around 1700 to 1500 BC, during what archaeologists call the Neopalatial period. The great palaces were rebuilt after an earlier destruction event around 1700 BC, and the new structures were more elaborate than their predecessors. Trade connections extended across the Mediterranean. The artistic tradition produced some of its most celebrated works. There is evidence for an extensive administrative system managing agricultural production, craft production, and trade. Then the evidence becomes difficult. Around 1500 BC, there were major destructions at a number of Minoan sites. The volcanic eruption of the island of Thera, modern Santorini, north of Crete, is often cited in this context. The Theran eruption was one of the largest volcanic events of the Holocene, with an estimated volcanic explosivity index rating among the highest ever recorded for a historical period. It buried the Minoan-influenced settlement of Akrotiri under meters of ash and pumice, and it almost certainly caused widespread environmental disruption across the Aegean region. The precise relationship between the Theran eruption and the decline of Minoan civilization has been debated extensively. Early scholars often proposed a direct causal link, arguing that the eruption destroyed the Minoan fleet, disrupted agriculture through ashfall, and generated tsunamis that devastated coastal settlements. More recent research has complicated this picture. The eruption is now dated, on the basis of both ice core evidence and radiocarbon dating, to somewhere in the range of 1600 to 1530 BC, which is somewhat earlier than the main period of palace destructions in Crete. This chronological gap has led some researchers to argue that the eruption alone cannot explain the collapse of the palace system. What is clear is that by around 1400 BC, the palace of Knossos had come under the administration of Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. The appearance of Linear B tablets at Knossos, written in early Greek, is the most direct evidence for this transition. Whether this represents conquest, political succession, or a more complex process of cultural absorption remains debated. The DNA evidence does not directly address this question, since the available samples are from the earlier Minoan period. But it does establish that the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, while genetically related, were not the same population, and that the Mycenaean takeover of Knossos represented a genuine shift in the genetic as well as cultural composition of the ruling elite at the site. This transition is significant for a reason that connects the genetic evidence to the broader question of European history. The Mycenaeans, who eventually dominated the Aegean, carried the Indo-European linguistic and genetic heritage that would eventually feed into classical Greek civilization. The Minoans they absorbed, displaced, or succeeded carried an older Neolithic substrate that was gradually overwritten. When classical Greek civilization emerged in the first millennium BC, it was built on a foundation that included both layers: the older Neolithic European tradition represented by the Minoans and related populations, and the more recent Indo-European stratum introduced by Bronze Age migrations. Understanding this layered history is essential for any accurate account of where European civilization actually came from. There is another dimension to the Minoan story that the DNA evidence illuminates in a different way. It concerns not the origins of the Minoans themselves, but the question of their relationship to the broader populations of the Aegean and the Greek mainland, both before and after the Bronze Age. One of the genetic findings of the 2017 study, and of the subsequent research that has expanded on it, is that modern Aegean and Greek populations retain a significant proportion of the ancestry associated with ancient Minoans and Mycenaeans. This genetic continuity is not absolute. The Bronze Age Aegean was followed by the upheavals of the Late Bronze Age collapse, migration events of the early 1st millennium BC, Roman period population movements, Byzantine demographic changes, and later historical migrations. All of these events left genetic traces on modern Aegean populations, but the ancient Aegean substrate remains detectable, and it connects modern Greeks and other Aegean peoples to the Minoan and Mycenaean populations in a biologically meaningful way. This continuity, when placed alongside the earlier finding that the Minoans were not of African or Egyptian origin, produces a picture of deep, long-term population stability in the Aegean, combined with the specific external influences and genetic contributions that historical events introduced. The people who built Knossos were not arrivals from the south. They were a population with deep European roots who had been developing in the Aegean region for thousands of years before the palaces were constructed. And something of that population, transformed and mixed but still genetically traceable, persists in the Aegean today. The implications of this finding reach into areas that go well beyond ancient DNA as a discipline. One of the most persistent cultural assumptions in Western thinking about civilization is that it flowed in a single direction, from east to south to north, from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece to Rome to Europe. The Minoan evidence disrupts this model at its foundations. Consider the timeline more carefully. The Neolithic Anatolian populations that were ancestral to the Minoans had already been developing farming societies, settled communities, and increasingly complex material cultures for thousands of years before the Minoan palaces were built. By the time Arthur Evans was excavating Knossos and wondering whether these people had come from Egypt, the population he was puzzling over had already been developing in the Aegean context for perhaps 3,000 years or more before the construction of the earliest palace phases. Egypt is ancient. Its civilization is one of the great achievements of human history. But in the Aegean context, the Minoans were not the students. They were independent peers, drawing on their own long tradition of Neolithic development and creating something genuinely distinctive in the process. The question of what the Minoans actually achieved, beyond what they borrowed or adapted, becomes more interesting when their independent origin is taken seriously. The drainage and plumbing systems at Knossos represent one frequently cited example. The palace complex included clay pipes for the transport of water and waste that show a level of hydraulic engineering sophistication not matched in Egypt or Mesopotamia of the same period. The pipes were designed with tapering joints and curves that modern engineers recognize as consistent with hydraulic principles governing water flow and pressure. Whether this represents empirical discovery or theoretical understanding, we cannot say, but it represents an independent achievement that has no obvious parallel in Egyptian engineering. The Minoan approach to palace architecture also differs in important ways from Egyptian and Mesopotamian conventions. Where Egyptian and Near Eastern palaces tend to emphasize monumental exteriors, grand approaches, and visible assertions of royal power, the Minoan palaces of Crete are more inward-looking. They are built around central court spaces rather than oriented toward impressive facades. They appear to have served multiple functions simultaneously, including storage, administration, religious ceremony, and possibly craft production. This is a different social model of palatial organization, and while it may have parallels in other Bronze Age contexts, it is not simply an imitation of Egyptian or Near Eastern templates. The frescoes of the Minoan world, taken as a whole, reveal a society with a distinctive set of preoccupations. Nature appears constantly, rendered with genuine observational care. Sea creatures, birds, plants, and landscapes are depicted with an attention to naturalistic detail that was unusual in the ancient world. The famous spring fresco from Crete, buried under Theran volcanic ash and preserved in extraordinary condition, shows a landscape of flowering lilies and swooping swallows, rendered with what can only be described as delight in the natural world. Whatever religious or symbolic meaning this painting carried, it also reflects a way of seeing that was specifically Minoan, not imported, not derivative. The bull-leaping imagery, which appears at Knossos and at other sites, has no clear parallel in Egyptian or Near Eastern iconography. Figures, both male and female to judge by the color conventions, are shown grasping the horns of charging bulls and vaulting over their backs. Whether this was a ritual performance, a competitive sport, or a symbolic representation of something else entirely, we do not know for certain. But it is distinctively Cretan. It belongs to a cultural tradition that was working out its own meanings, its own symbols, its own relationships between human beings and the natural world. None of this was borrowed from Egypt. It emerged from a civilization with its own Neolithic roots, its own long history of development in the Aegean, and its own distinctive way of engaging with the world it inhabited. And yet the Minoans were not isolated. This is where the picture becomes genuinely complex, and where the DNA evidence needs to be held alongside the archaeological and historical evidence rather than used to replace it. The cultural connections between Minoan Crete and Egypt were real and significant. The Minoan-style frescoes discovered at Avaris in the Nile Delta, at the site associated with the Hyksos rulers who controlled northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, are among the most important and puzzling discoveries in recent Aegean archaeology. These frescoes, excavated by Manfred Bietak and his team from the Austrian Archaeological Institute, show motifs that are unmistakably Minoan, including bull-leaping, running spirals, and hunting scenes rendered in a style that is essentially identical to what appears at Knossos and Akrotiri. They were painted on Egyptian walls at a site where Egyptian, Canaanite, and Minoan material culture all appear in the same archaeological layers. What were Minoan-style frescoes doing in the Egyptian Nile Delta? The question does not have a simple answer. One possibility is that Minoan craftspeople were physically present at Avaris, brought there to work for Hyksos rulers who may have had political or commercial relationships with Crete. Another possibility is that local craftspeople were trained in Minoan techniques, perhaps by traveling Aegean artists. A third possibility involves the complex politics of the Second Intermediate Period, when the Hyksos rulers who controlled the Delta may have sought legitimacy through association with Aegean cultural prestige. Whatever the explanation, the Avaris frescoes are evidence not of Egyptian cultural influence flowing into Crete, but of something considerably more interesting, Minoan cultural influence moving outward into Egypt, carried by a civilization confident enough in its own identity to project its art and material culture onto foreign walls. This outward projection of cultural influence is consistent with what the DNA evidence implies: an independent people with their own deep roots, not a dependent periphery of Egyptian civilization, would be exactly the kind of society capable of exerting cultural influence across the Mediterranean, rather than simply receiving it. The trade networks that connected the Minoans to Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Aegean also deserve to be seen in this light. Archaeological evidence from sites across the eastern Mediterranean confirms that Minoan goods moved widely. Characteristic Minoan pottery, known as Kamari's ware for the style produced during the Middle Minoan period, has been found in Egypt, in the Levant, and across the Aegean. The distinctive rippling designs and thin walls of this pottery were produced to a high standard that was recognized and valued across a wide geographic range. The movement of goods was not unidirectional. Egyptian objects appear in Crete. Canaanite items appear in Minoan contexts. The palace storerooms at Knossos and Phaistos contained goods from across the eastern Mediterranean. But the Minoans in this picture were not simply consumers of outside products. They were producers and exporters of goods that other advanced civilizations wanted. This commercial confidence reflects a civilization that had developed substantial productive capacity on its own terms. The olive oil, wine, and textiles that were apparently among the major Minoan exports required sophisticated agricultural management and craft production. The Linear A administrative system that tracked these goods was a homegrown bureaucratic achievement. The ships that carried Minoan goods across the Aegean were built by a seafaring people who had mastered open-water navigation centuries before the Greek classical period. All of this independent achievement becomes more comprehensible, not less, when the Egyptian origin hypothesis is set aside. A civilization that developed from Neolithic Anatolian roots in the Aegean context over thousands of years would have had time to develop its own administrative traditions, its own religious frameworks, its own technological capabilities. It did not need to import civilization from Egypt. It grew its own. The implications of this for European history are significant enough that they deserve to be stated clearly. For a very long time, the narrative of how civilization came to Europe placed the primary creative force outside Europe. The sophisticated cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt were the sources. Greece was the transmission point. Rome was the diffusion mechanism. Europe was the recipient. In this model, Europe contributed relatively little to the early development of what we call civilization. It received, adapted, and eventually surpassed its teachers. The Minoan evidence, read through the lens of the DNA data, suggests a different model. The people who built the palace at Knossos were not receiving civilization from Africa. They were expressing a civilizational achievement that had been developing in the Aegean and across Europe for thousands of years. The Neolithic Anatolian tradition that they inherited was not primitive. It was the foundation of a remarkably persistent and creative cultural lineage that produced extraordinary results wherever it settled, from the megalithic monuments of Western Europe to the painted caves of earlier periods to the sophisticated palace economies of Bronze Age Crete. Framing the Minoans as fundamentally European, in the genetic sense established by the DNA evidence, means acknowledging that the roots of sophisticated civilization in Europe are older and more autochthonous than older models suggested. It means recognizing that the people of the Aegean were not cultural dependents of Egypt, but independent actors with their own traditions, their own achievements, and their own cultural exports. It also means grappling honestly with what was lost. The fall of Minoan civilization was one of the major cultural losses of the ancient world. The unreadable Linear A tablets contain information that will probably never be fully recovered. The religious beliefs of the Minoans, the precise meanings of their rituals, the stories told in their painted rooms, the structure of their political systems, all of this is deeply obscure and may never be fully illuminated. We have the material remains but not the living tradition. We have the buildings but not the voices. What the DNA evidence gives back is something smaller but still important. It gives back a correct understanding of who these people were at the most fundamental biological level. It tells us that they were not brought to the Aegean by Egyptian or African migrations. They were there because their ancestors had been working their way westward from Anatolia thousands of years before the palaces were built. They were a European people, in the genetic sense that this term has any meaning, and their civilization was a European achievement. The further implications of this finding extend into questions about the Bronze Age collapse more generally. Around 1200 BC, in a remarkably short period of time, most of the major palace civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean disappeared or were severely disrupted. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were abandoned. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia collapsed. The city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was destroyed and never rebuilt. Egypt survived but was severely weakened. The disruption was so widespread and so sudden that it constitutes one of the greatest civilizational collapses in human history, and its causes remain contested. The Minoans, of course, had already been absorbed into or superseded by Mycenaean Crete by the time the late Bronze Age collapse occurred. The palace at Knossos had been destroyed or abandoned in its Mycenaean phase sometime around 1400 to 1300 BC, before the wider collapse. But the Minoan contribution to the interconnected Bronze Age world that collapsed was substantial. The trade networks, administrative techniques, artistic traditions, and social organizations that characterized the Eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age all bore the mark of Minoan development in some form. When that world collapsed, something of what the Minoans had helped build collapsed with it. The writing systems disappeared. The palace economies vanished. The long-distance trade networks broke down. What emerged from the Dark Age that followed was classical Greek civilization, which bore genetic continuity with the Minoan world, but had lost much of the material and administrative sophistication that the Bronze Age had achieved. The rediscovery of that lost world, through the archaeology of the past 120 years, has been one of the great intellectual adventures of modern scholarship. The DNA evidence is the latest and in some ways most surprising chapter in that adventure. It closes a debate that began with Arthur Evans and his Egyptian hypotheses and resolves it in a direction that opens up much larger questions about the deep roots of European civilization and the independent creative capacity of the peoples who built it. There are questions that remain unresolved and will require future research to address. The decipherment of Linear A, if it ever becomes possible, would transform understanding of Minoan civilization in ways that are currently difficult to anticipate. Additional ancient DNA sampling from a wider range of Minoan period sites across Crete and the broader Aegean would provide a more complete and geographically diverse genetic picture. Better dating of the Theran eruption and its relationship to the archaeological destructions of the period would clarify the debate about what caused the transitions of the 15th century BC. And continuing analysis of the Avaris frescoes and other evidence of Minoan cultural presence outside Crete would help clarify the nature and extent of Minoan influence across the eastern Mediterranean. What the current evidence demonstrates, clearly and without ambiguity on the central point, is that the Minoans were not Egyptian. They were not a North African founding population that brought civilization to an otherwise primitive Aegean world. They were a people rooted in the Neolithic Anatolian tradition that seeded farming and settled life across much of Europe, and they built one of the most sophisticated and distinctive civilizations of the ancient world from that foundation. This is not a minor correction to an old theory. It is a fundamental reorientation of how the Minoan civilization fits into the larger story of human history. The old model placed the Minoans in a subordinate position as recipients of a civilizational gift from Africa and the Near East. The DNA evidence places them in a position of independent agency, as inheritors of a long European tradition who developed their own answers to the challenges of organizing complex societies, managing resources, representing the world through art, and engaging with the wider Mediterranean world as confident participants rather than peripheral learners. That distinction matters. It matters for how we understand the deep past. It matters for how we understand the origins of civilization in Europe. And it matters for how we think about the capacity of ancient peoples to develop complexity and sophistication from their own internal resources, rather than through dependence on more advanced neighbors. The frescoes of Knossos and Akrotiri were painted by people whose ancestors had walked out of Anatolia thousands of years before, crossed the Aegean, settled in the warm valleys and coastal plains of Crete, and slowly built a world of extraordinary richness. They depicted the sea creatures in the waters around their island with the affectionate precision of people who had lived alongside those creatures for generations. They painted their young athletes leaping over bulls with a confidence that speaks of ceremony and meaning that we can sense but not fully recover. They built a palace complex whose drainage system still impresses engineers today, and they tracked the movement of goods across the Mediterranean with a bureaucratic efficiency that rivaled anything their contemporaries had achieved. These were not borrowed achievements. They were the product of a people with their own deep roots, their own long history, and their own creative intelligence. The DNA that was extracted from bones in a cave on the Lasithi Plateau confirmed what the archaeological evidence had always suggested to those willing to let the evidence speak on its own terms. The Minoans were Europeans, in the oldest and deepest sense of that genetic label, and the civilization they created belongs not to Africa's legacy, not to Egypt's shadow, but to the long story of what the peoples of the Aegean and of Europe built from the Neolithic onward. The fact that we are still learning this, still correcting a century of misdirection, still assembling the evidence needed to see these ancient people as they actually were, is itself a reminder of how much ancient history has yet to yield. The bones speak when the technology is ready to listen, and what they have said about the Minoans has changed European history, not by adding a new detail, but by restoring to one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations the true story of where it came from.